Oh, all right.
He sounds like an exciting meeting.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah, and everybody's there because they had all this place people and it was we had all of the volunteers like for paths were all lined up.
okay. Well, this should be a full house then.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see.
I'll try not to be offended.
They should be down at daytime.
That's good. Chris could probably use some training in that. He's the one who approves mine. He always tells me not to bother approving my blue time and stuff. I think it's because he doesn't actually know how to do it. Yeah, don't bother. Just take that.
Even the training that you'll be like,
Hello?
no,
Are you?
you can look at it all.
A little soggy.
Yeah, I know. I drove today.
But that's
I dropped my daughter off at school.
Yeah, when you gotta do that stuff. And I started going through so many locations now, I might end up, I just don't want the loan payments. I'm looking against a car, I just don't want to pay a loan.
Yeah,
You don't want to pay gas and insurance.
Yeah.
I've been free of that for such a long time, it's given me so much extra spending cash for things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Try.
right now, might be such an advantage here because it's offshore trying to find a place to park.
Yeah.
First, like this morning, first time I've had to
and
do
you
it.
don't have like days.
Since they started all this construction, it was took me forever.
And the funny thing is, you put on, like I got that, you put on for your cats, and that coat's all zipped up and it's got a bit of your talent, right? But from the condensation, I get just as wet sometimes.
Oh, yeah. I know.
And I don't just,
Yeah, totally.
They couldn't even they weren't going to log in at all. Is this thing on? It's in Edmonton. Am I on? Is this live? Good morning, everybody. Morning, Calgary staff. Good morning, Edmonton. Okay. My name is Bill. I'm here to do the announcements this morning. The shelter staff are out enjoying an off-site team building opportunity. And that's one of the reasons why our numbers have dwindled a little bit, because real Bill and the team are leading that up right now and taking care of business down at the shelter while they do their thing. So yeah, if you have any questions for some of the staff, you probably send them emails or try to get a hold of them down there at the shelter number. They will probably respond as they're holding down the fort. The memorial for Christian is today at 2 p.m., I believe, in this room. If any of you knew Christian, the resident who passed on Friday, you can come and share memories and take part in the memorial today at 2 p.m., led by Chaplain David. Just so you guys know, for staff volunteer events, this would be like volunteering as a staff for the Mustard Seed. We have the gala coming up, and there's also Calgary Corporate Challenge this month. And so if you're interested in helping out in any of those events or in some sort of capacity around that, you can check with Kaylee in development or Donna, the events coordinator at the moment, working with Roseanne and the team. This week's speaker is Jonathan from Edmonton. He is our reintegration chaplain, and he's going to be sharing with us some great insights from his job and just things he knows about God and all the rest of it. So we want to invite him up. Next week's speaker is the one and only Steve Weil, a wonderful CEO here at the Mustard Seed. So be sure to attend that next week. And John, take it away, buddy.
Can you hear me in Calgary? Are you catching me? Can you hear me? Did somebody nod? Nodding what direction?
Bring the speaker closer.
Okay. We're just gonna figure this out.
There we go.
Can you hear me now? Yeah? All right. Yes, that's good. Okay. Great. Well, thanks for having me. My name is Jonathan. I work as the reintegration chaplain here at the Mustard Seed in Edmonton, as was said. So what that means is that I support men and women who are leaving Canada's prison system, mostly the federal prison system, and who are resettling in the Edmonton area. And I do that along with my colleague Debbie here in Edmonton. And because that's what I do, I spend a lot of my, usually Thursday afternoons, at a local halfway house and healing center called Stan Daniels. And Stan Daniels is a place that focuses on serving Indigenous men who are transitioning from federal prison out into the street. And so every Thursday, I walk through 2 sets of glass doors, up a short flight of stairs, and into the sweet smell of sage grass and fried food. Indigenous parole officers and administrators and parolees are usually milling around the hallway at the top of those stairs and at the front desk, filling out paperwork and discussing their plans for the weekend. And often, of the dozen or so people around me, I'm one of the only people with white skin. Brown skin is the norm there, which I think is beautiful. And my whiteness makes me an outsider. One of the many reasons that I'm thankful for those Thursday afternoons, besides getting to try the things that are cooking in the kitchen there and catching up with folks at the house, one of the other things that I'm thankful for is that it's a bodily reminder of my privilege. More often than not, I am not forced to think about my whiteness. And the same goes for other aspects of my privilege, my gender, or my sexual orientation, or my economic status. I spend much of my life unaware of the doors that are opening for me that might be shutting for someone else. I'm not forced to think about how the way I look, or my tax bracket, or my upbringing, how those things affect my present or my future. And I think that's actually a pretty good definition of privilege, actually. As my friend Rebecca Warren has taught me, if you don't have to think about your skin color, or your gender, or your tax bracket that often, then there's a good chance that you hold some privilege. Privilege is about all those things that you don't have to think about. So for me, I don't go into job interviews worried that the employer might reject me because I'm straight. And I wouldn't avoid meeting with a landlord in person because I'm afraid that they won't rent to someone who's white or middle class. I don't often wonder whether a local church is going to let me speak in the front because I'm a man. I don't ask that question that often. I don't worry that a new friend or boss is going to kick me to the curb because I don't have a criminal record. I don't wonder whether the staff at the Bay is following me around because it looks like I sleep inside at night. So see what I mean? I never think about those things, unlike a good number of the men that I meet in prison, or the folks we meet at the Neighbor Center, or in PAC, or in some of our other programs. And that means that I hold some privilege. Just by virtue of working at the mustard seed at all, just holding a decent and stable job. Most of us hold some degree of privilege, some of us more than others. And that means that most of us hold some power. Privilege is power. Doors will open for us that may not open for others. Opportunities come our way that may not be offered to others. Communities make space for us in ways that they might not make space for someone else, just by virtue of our skin color or our tax bracket or whatever. So there's power in all of that. Power to make things happen, power to pursue the life that you want. Now, thankfully, it's harder and harder to ignore the workings of privilege in our culture. Things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada and the work of Indigenous and women's activists in our country and elsewhere, they've kept the reality of privilege on our radars, and I think that's a good thing. But for many of us, I think it's still not something that we think a lot about, unless, of course, our lack of power or privilege forces us to think about it all the time. So now you may be asking, so what? Why does that matter? Why does privilege matter? Why do we have to talk about it? Well, one reason is the reason I just mentioned. a good number of the folks that we support at the Mustard Seed, folks leaving prison, folks working the street, the working poor, or the folks that we meet at the food depot, they're regularly confronted with their lack of privilege or power. I think of the folks that I spend those Thursday afternoons with at the halfway house. How many of them have told me that job interviews were ended when the interviewer found out about their criminal record, and that was that? How many have told me about times that their landlords or that potential landlords said no to them or just ended a phone conversation with them once they found out that their last name was Cardinal or Whiskey Jack? I have heard countless stories like that at Stan Daniels. And that's just the men. My colleague Debbie has even more of those stories from the women that she supports. So one reason why privilege, who does or doesn't have it, how it works, and why. One reason that it should be on our radar is that it can be difficult, it can make life difficult for those we serve to flourish. Part of what I think Jesus was up to, and is still up to now, is redeeming our broken world so that our broken relationships with each other and the land and with God, that those relationships can be healed. Healed so that everyone gets a chance to flourish. Healed so that we can get a little closer to that shalom world of peace and delight that God longs for. Privilege sometimes deepens the brokenness in those relationships instead of healing it. And at the Mustard Seed, in one way or another, we want to be healers and not destroyers. We want to make space for people to flourish. So that's one reason why I think we should be thinking about privilege. I also think that being aware of our own privilege and all of the sort of historical and cultural reasons that we may or may not have access to power, one reason it's good to think about that is it's an opportunity for us to grow, to become who we were created to be. So it's not just about the people we serve, that's important, but it's also about who we were created to be. Why? Well, part of becoming aware of our own privilege involves trying to imagine what it might be like to be somebody else. What would it be like for me to live the life of the guys that I meet at Stan Daniels? That act of imagination can make us more loving, I think, and more compassionate, more open to God's movement in our lives and in our world. So, we've talked a little bit about privilege and what it is, though I think a lot more could be said about it. We've said a little bit about why it's important. Well, let's talk a little bit about what we can do about it. What I don't want for us this morning is to leave thinking, well, shoot, now I just feel bad for being a man or for being white or for having a decent job or whatever it is. Most of those things that give us access to privilege and power are beyond our control. We didn't choose where we were going to be born or what we would look like or all those things. A friend of mine, a writer named Ben Hertwig, he says that being a person of privilege doesn't mean that you're evil. It just means that we've got work to do. So what is that work? Well, I just want to say two things that I think we can do as people of faith. One, I think, is to begin with repentance. Repentance. It's a pretty churchy word, so it's worthwhile maybe asking what it means. Well, literally, it just means a turning. Feeling some regret, a sense of being sorry. Acknowledging that there's been some wrongdoing, either by us or by people that have come before us. And then turning toward a new world and a new way of being. I think so often when we're faced with our own privilege, we get defensive. I know I can. Well, it's not my fault that my parents have money, or it's not my fault that I'm white or a man. What can I do about that? Or maybe it's not my fault that those men back then created the Indian residential school system. What can I do about that?
What do you want me to do about it? But what if, instead of getting defensive, we could be humble enough to say, yeah, it sucks that people who looked like me and prayed like me and talked like me helped create those residential schools and did so much to hurt so many people. I'm really sorry that that happened, and I get why you'd be angry. What if I could be humble and patient enough to say, yeah, the world is probably harder for you than it is for me. What can we do about it to move forward together? That's repentance. These two community organizers that I really respect and that I've learned a lot from, Mark Gornick and Alan Tibbles, they say that repentance is not just feeling sorry or apologizing or engaging in rituals of regret, but it's an invitation to open up a new worldview, to put an end to business as usual. So as we go about our work at the Mustard Seed, I hope we can start with repentance. A second thing we can do, I think, when we're confronted with our own privilege and the lack of it among so many people we meet here, is we can share a little of the power that's been given to us. Often in these discussions of privilege, folks with privilege, folks like me, they say things like, just use your power for good. Use your privilege for good. It's kind of like superhero mentality, right? Use your powers that you've been given for good. And I think that's fine as far as it goes. But I also think we can take a page from Jesus' playbook. Philippians 2, the Apostle Paul says that Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man. And being found in human form, he humbled himself even more. Humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So Jesus had all of the privilege and power available to him. In the form of God, he was. Yet he did not count equality with God something to be grasped, Paul says. But instead, he got his hands dirty alongside the poor and marginal of the earth, spending time with Samaritan women and lepers and tax fraudsters and other outcasts, standing with them until they were welcomed and had the chance to flourish, or until he was crucified, whatever came first. Jesus was humble enough to share his power and privilege with the lost, including you and I, so that we could get in on God's story of new life for everybody. So I wonder if we can do something similar with whatever privilege we may have. Not just using our power for good, which doesn't necessarily ask that much of us, but giving some of it up and sharing it with others. So maybe that means letting our community members tell their own stories instead of us telling it for them. Maybe that means asking our community members to help serve meals or to give input into our programs. Maybe it means using our voice, the voice that our privilege may give us, to say, hey, here are some other voices that you should listen to as well. Maybe it means asking for folks without as much privilege as us to sit on boards or committees that they might not be asked to otherwise. Sharing power, or giving some of it up so that everyone gets a chance to flourish. It's going to look different depending on who you are and where you're at and what you've been given. But it will probably ask us to be a bit more trusting and a bit more humble, a bit more like Jesus. So in other words, it's going to be hard work. But we have a lifetime ahead of us to learn, and we have Jesus' Spirit to join us as we try. As one of my guys always tells me, nothing worth doing is going to be easy anyway. So you just go ahead and do it. Thanks for listening.